Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, Chris and Mark. My name is Patricia Kong, and this is a webinar that I've really been looking forward to for a while. So we recently released, with the help of Mark and Chris, the PAL-EBM course at Scrum.org in July. 2021. It's September 2021, almost October. And this will be the first Ask a PST, talk to an expert about evidence-based management. So that's what we're going to be doing today, getting your questions in. So just a little bit on rules of engagement. Mark, if you could forward through. Your microphones will be muted. But the session is being recorded, so this is something that you'll be able to take a look back afterwards. My colleague Lindsay will be posting this up on our website like she does with all of our webinars. And at the bottom of the Zoom, you'll see the Q&A. So you can pop in your questions there, and I'll be taking the questions with Mark and Chris. And any questions that we don't get to, we will find a way to respond to them, either through a blog or a video or reaching out directly. All right, so what's going to happen? Next slide. Scrum.org, this is who we are, consistent global community. We are founded by Ken Schwaber. He's this gentleman on the screen here. A good buddy of mine, and what we think about a lot is thought leadership training, certification, ongoing learning. So the certification is validation. Mark and Chris are PSTs, and I'll let them introduce themselves after I introduce myself very briefly. So that's me when I was a little bit younger with longer hair. But what I think about at Scrum.org is enterprise agility. So the things that work at the team level, how do we let bottom-up intelligence and self-management of the teams thrive in the organization? I look at the barriers, that some of the things that impede agility at the organizational level. What are those things? So evidence-based management is obviously one of those. Look at scaling. I am a mentor. I am very passionate about working with underprivileged and trying to bridge that opportunity gap. We do a lot of work with this organization called Europe, so that's something I do. I like to think about how people think, how organizations think, and then I try to practice what I preach because I come from a very corporate background. So it's a lifelong learning experience for me. I'll pass it over, I think, to Chris now. Do a quick introduction.
Yep. Hey, everyone. I'm Chris Conlin. I'm a product coach and trainer with Insight Digital Innovation. I've been working in Scrum for the last 10 years or so, mostly as a product owner. I teach a lot of our product owner classes. I like to say that I played the Lazy Man's Olympics, which are cornhole, for those of you that are from the Midwest. Ping pong and Frisbee golf are my passions. And then I'm from Kentucky. Really excited to answer your questions today and talk about evidence-based management.
I just discovered that PowerPoint isn't Southern. It doesn't, like, you see how y'all's got the little squiggly line under it? That's awesome. Oh man, we're gonna have fun today. All right, my name is Mark Wavle. I'm also a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org here, and I am lead trainer, professional coach at Unstuck Careers. Just launched into that last month in August. So that's that bright orange logo you see right there, where I get to help people that are stuck in their careers get unstuck through things like professional Scrum training and Agile Leadership training, and also professional coaching. I've got 25 years of experience largely in the software development industry as a development team member, business analyst, Scrum Master, product owner, Agile coach, and trainer. And I've had tremendous opportunities to speak and train all over the place. That I just love doing that. So you can see what I love right there. And my nickname is Question Mark. So if we get into a conversation sometime, I'll probably have a couple of those for you as we go along. All right. So I'm so glad that you're all here. And Chris can attest to that. I'm so glad you're all here.
I'm just do things about you both during the both sessions, and we talk consistently every week. Like, who knew you could have a question mark as a nickname? And now we know, Chris Conlin, what you can bring to our next face-to-face live event, which is your Lazy Man Olympics. So get your questions into the Q&A. We'll be looking at those. And I think the first thing, I'm just going to take a couple minutes. And for those of you who haven't heard about evidence-based management before, or haven't heard about our approach from Scrum.org around evidence-based management, it might help you to understand a little bit of the origin story. So 10 years ago, when I joined Scrum.org, about 10 years ago, Ken Traber was working on something called the Continuous Improvement Framework, which transitioned with the help of a product owner, Afa Bittaker, and they were looking at enterprise Scrum and agility path and all these different things. And it almost felt like at that time, it was too early to talk about, let's just say, an enterprise agility, business agility. Like, what does that mean if a whole organization wants to pivot at that time? Obviously, people were thinking about it. And what everybody started to do was jam on the Scrum is so awesome, let's scale Agile. And there were two things that happened. Ken was like, okay, if we want to scale agility, then let's look at that basis, the nexus. Let's look at the genesis of nexus actually in EBM is really of how do teams work together, right? And then he kind of pulled that through and he said, you know what, if we're gonna devote so much effort into scaling agility in the organization, how do we know that Agile is even working for us? Where is the value in that? And it seemed like people were talking so much about processes that they forgot the notion of what are we trying to do with agility in the first place. And so that kind of drove us into looking at this really big notion of what is the evidence? What do we actually measure to show that we're making progress? So how do we inspect and adapt on a different, on a enterprise level, so that we can know that we're moving in the right direction. And if not, then how do we pivot? And so there was that, and we had worked at that time looking at 3 key value areas. So current value, time to market, and ability to innovate. And it was really just that. And then he started to pull from ideas from evidence-based medicine, where it's like, you're not going to be, well, I need this information. We usually keep information and data about our cholesterol, weight, whatever, but I can only make an educated decision with different areas of information, different evidence. And it's not going to be a sure thing, but it's going to give me some information. And that's how we can start to make decisions based off of, holistic information, looking at those KVAs, those 3 key value areas at that time. So that's really how EBM started, the thought process started to get into it. And then it's, of course, what metrics, what are those things? Kurt Bittner and I worked in pulling into, well, we actually should talk about goals. And then we found that, I forget what year it was now, but recently. We found that we had been talking to people about measurement. We see that come up, obviously, our thinking is in the recent update of the Scrum Guide 2020. But what we found is that a lot of people would say, hey, Patricia, I'm doing EBM, I'm measuring. And I said, oh, how's it going? They go, I'm measuring. So he said, what are you doing? I'm measuring. So it was the importance of, what experiments do you run off of that? What do you do to continuously improve? That was the thing that we injected into the EBM guide. So I'll stop, but I just wanted to give a little bit of history so that you guys could get your questions in, frankly. But I'll pass it over to Chris and Mark to talk a little bit more about what EBM is.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. That's a good background. When we talk about evidence-based management, what I like to think of is what is it not? And I think you see organizations on either side of a continuum. One where they're absolutely confident that what they're pursuing is the right direction to be pursuing without data, without evidence, without anything to support that. Or you have organizations that are just doing a whole bunch of things and running a whole bunch of experiments without well-formulated hypotheses or any kind of data, and they're pouring all kinds of money into these. Evidence-based management is trying to find the balance between the two things of how do we pursue value and how do we have more of an educated hypothesis about what value is and leverage evidence by running things in small experiments to test and say, this is worth us continuing in. and looking holistically at the organization, not just from a value perspective, but also our ability to deliver value and capability. And that's where the KVAs came in, the key value areas. I'm guessing we'll have some questions about those. But when I think evidence-based management, that's what I think of: an approach, a tool to help organizations pursue value incrementally and use evidence to make better decisions.
What about you, Mark? Is there anything that, the Mark Wavle spin on EBM?
Yeah, I think very similar to Chris. I would probably use words like curiosity. That's how I would describe some of what Chris was talking about there. It's easy to get into our biases. I see many times in myself and others that even when we get data and gather data, that we're doing it with a bias, like unconscious in many cases, of saying, how does this data support the conclusion that I already have, right? And I think what evidence-based management invites us to do empirically is to ask some better questions. You would expect nothing less of Mark to say questions after my introduction there. Questions, I mean, we typically ask questions like, how is our revenue, right? We don't have to remember to ask, how's our revenue, what's our margin? Those kind of questions are going to be asked in the organization and are important to ask. What about some other questions in balance, or better questions like, what's the satisfaction gap that our customer has? Because we can look in the littered history of failed companies and see that the moments when they made those decisions that brought them down ultimately were moments very likely when they had a high margin and high revenue. But how can they be curious about, like, what's the gap that we can aim for example? Or another one is, how can I, instead of just asking how's progress toward our goal, which is an important question, but also usually we don't have to remember to ask it, is how can we ask a question like, when would we know that our goal is no longer worth pursuing in its current form? And that's
super important during COVID.
Yeah, right? Sure. When do we shift? So that's kind of how I look at evidence-based management. It's enabling us to ask those better, deeper questions that get us, the better outcomes that we're going for, that focus us on the customer, and ultimately balance that capability of us to deliver and the actual results that our customers need.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the word outcomes. And that's something obviously that we drum in about around outputs versus outcomes. And, there's the question about OKRs, and we can talk about that. One thing that EBM really thinks about, and this is where the fourth key value area came in of unrealized value, is what it asks you to do is to stop navel gazing. So it asks you to say, hey, what actually are we trying to satisfy for the customer, and is that useful? And unrealized value also says, hey, there's an opportunity and a goal that we're looking at. There's a satisfaction gap. There's a problem. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to close that gap? Is there that value there? And so that's really cool. All right. Chris Conlin, for an organization that has never used evidence-based management before, how would you start using it? I have to hold back from trying to answer it myself. How would you start using it?
I think it. Oh, I was going to say, I'm not going to say it depends, but I think it's largely dependent on what your environment is. The first place I'd recommend is figuring out where are you at now. What's your current state? What value are you getting out of your product, out of your organization? How are you doing at delivering value to your customers? And finding out where are their gaps. Too often, Mark and I both have a history of working with organizations and going in as consultants. We go in, and too often people don't know where they're at now, and they're under this label of we want to improve. And not knowing what improvement is, it's tough to boil the ocean all at the same time. So figuring out where you're at, where are your biggest challenges, and start formulating hypotheses or experiments. You talked about the satisfaction gap, Patricia. Finding out what is something that our customers need that we can deliver, and how do we start putting measurements around that as part of the process.
What about you, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it varies, of course. So I'm going to give the consultant answer of it depends, because it does depend on where you're starting. I think what Chris just laid out is an excellent framework with which to look through this, or lens, I should say, to look at this through. So there's some element of where are you at today. There's also a danger in just like, let's spend a year figuring out where we're at today. Most organizations I've worked with don't have that ability, and probably wouldn't be a good investment to do that. There'd be some waste in that. So how do you understand where you're at today just enough to get curious about it and about where you can go with it? That would be a starting spot for me. But I also want to recognize, like, Chris and I have taught the PAL-EBM class a number of times now, and I've been really pleasantly surprised when we followed up with some of the students to see the variety of starting spots that they've chosen. I mean, some of them are certainly going like, all right, so we're going to start with evidence-based management. We're setting up the empirical cycles and all the things I'm sure we'll talk about as we're getting into this here. We're going to start with measuring some things to understand our reality and setting some goals, right? We've also seen, that assumes that you've got the influence or authority to enact some of those things. So I think it's worthy of saying right now that even if you can't just say, all right, here's what we're doing, right? Or feel like you have the authority or influence to ask to do that, that we found that even, like, say, a Scrum Master who's, someone who's in a Scrum Master position was hired in, but actually they're being asked to be a project manager, for example. They're not actually being asked to influence much. That those types of students have also found that looking at it this way enables them to ask those better questions of the leaders around them who do have the influence, that starts them thinking in the directions Chris is talking about, right? Like, what is it that, basically asking the hypothesis questions or the goal questions, right? Or the balance measurements questions that can lead into the deeper areas that evidence-based management, the rich soil that it's trying to get us into, that are like, where are we trying to head? What is our hypothesis, our theory? If we do this, what do we think the result's going to be? How would we see? How would we observe that that's what we're getting, or that we're not getting? I mean, that's a core empirical discussion with, and you don't have to say, let's flip open the evidence-based management guide to have that discussion, and that can be very powerful too.
Chris?
I think one of the other things to add, because I work a lot with product owners, and that's my heart, that's my passion, is working with product owners. A lot of times they're put in a position where they're not empowered, like they're not in the true definition of an entrepreneurial product owner, and they're being told and mandated, here, go deliver this feature set or this thing, and it's not outcome focused. So asking questions for product owners, enabling them to ask questions, things like, how will we know we're successful? And then actually going back and validating that after it's actually put in the hands of customers. Just that is enough of a basis to get started asking even better questions and start to, I love how you use the word influence, Mark, start to influence some of those conversations across the board.
I can ask. So, the question again was, for an organization that's never used EBM, how would you start using it? And EBM, and Mark was hitting on this, is when you look at it, sometimes you just go, oh, that's just empiricism. Yes. So the question is the organization, does it have that mindset? And a lot of the times, Mark and I have had this conversation that people go, yeah, that agile stuff, I get it. But when you look at it, this is actually saying, do you really close that loop? Which is what Chris is talking about for product ownership. And yesterday I was talking to somebody and they were like, we create all these user stories. Do you actually ever see, when you throw it out there, are you tracking to see if it comes back? And that's going to affect your ability to innovate and time to market and value, right? So the ways, and I'll give a couple of examples how I've seen organizations start using it, is that they go, generally, when it's with a smaller organization, I've seen it this way. They say, let's think about our goals. Can we start there? And how we're going to work on a cadence, like Mark said. And other organizations, especially when they're larger, they're like, what do you mean goals? We're not going to talk. I'll fire you right away if you start talking to me about that. And so they say, let's baseline. Let's look at our cycle time. Let's look at our ability to innovate. So they'll start to track some of those measurements in terms of like the versions, how many, what if they're supporting, are they being held back at all? And just look at some things that they can clean up there and start to think about start to think about the experiments that they can run. Because what organizations generally do is they focus on that capability, time to market and ability to innovate. But sometimes if they don't start there, what they'll realize is that they are spending so much time, like they're unable to even capture value because their cycle time, they can't release. So
Yeah.
you know what, you would start there. And those are some ways to think about it. All right.
Can Mark has a story about that, actually. Mark, do you mind if I put you on the spot for that?
Sure.
Organizational
Do
level?
it.
Yeah, it's actually a really good story for this point too, because it was the start of an agile transformation. I was in a sales call, and I'm always in that first sales conversation. Hey, we want to do an agile transformation. I'm trying to find a way to respectfully ask, so what are you trying to get out of this? Like the why behind the transformation. And I ask that, I often get questions that I go, okay, I'm going to have to dig deeper. Like, we want to do faster. We want more. Like, we need to understand a little bit deeper here. This time, in this particular case, this was packaged software that they were creating and releasing for manufacturing lines, for example, and design and that kind of thing. And I walked in and I asked that question, and the answer, it was a sales call, so I didn't, but I wanted to hug the guy, because he just laid out, like, here's the challenges we're having in the measures, the indicators that we've got, that this is a problem for us, right? And he laid out 4 of them. I'll just highlight one right here, and that was that their release cycles were about 1.25 years. And then their customers would typically spend 3 to 6 months testing it in their environment. And then the average customer took every 3rd release. So if you do the math, you're looking at years, right? And they were starting to lose customers, which isn't surprising to most of us if we start doing the math there. But they were like, we know that we're losing customers. We're asking customers about this, and we'll have the data, and we have anecdotal data, and we have, very quantitative data that tells us that we need to shorten our release cycles significantly, right? And that for them was just one of the things they were looking at with that transformation, where they were saying our ability, the time to market for us is really important to our customers, because they're not able to get the features and functions that they find valuable fast enough. By the time we get it to them, they might not need it anymore. They asked for it 3 years ago, whatever it might be. The competitors had it for a while, and so they're just going with the competitor. So that, again, they had a lot of that type of thing that just was like, this is clear what you want and what you're looking at and what you're curious about trying to learn. And that was really powerful for them.
Thank you for sharing that. Now that you both are diving a little bit into the measurement, there's someone who's written in who, and I'll interpret it this way, they feel a little lost between the KVAs. And I'm going to think that what they're feeling a little bit confused about is just what goes where, and how do we think about the key value measurements in there. And I will caveat it with this: in the evidence-based management guide, we have the different 4 key value areas, and we make some suggestions, and we make some suggestions in other places of what types of metrics, what type of key value measures you might find in there. And Mark, you're always saying it's like moth to a flame, mosquito to a fire.
Yeah.
Something
Right.
like that, but people go straight for the metrics. And I think that what would you suggest in terms of people starting to think about, the measures that they're trying to slot into those different KVAs? How could they differentiate that? And I'm going to urge you to talk about output, outcome, and there you go.
Sure. Yeah. So like you said, moth to a flame. Well, first time I flipped through the guide, I was like, oh, interesting. It's very principled, and there's not a lot of I guess you'd say tactile things in there where you go like, oh, then you do this. I mean, it's even less specific than the Scrum guide, right? It's a lot more principled than that. And then you get to the appendix, you're like, oh, I get it, measures, right? So it's really easy to just, we need to put these measures in place. The first thing I would say is looking at the key value areas. The driver of those 4 key value areas, which I'll show you here in just a minute, we can talk through those, but the driver of those are questions that we're trying to answer, right? So we're trying to figure out in current value, like, hey, how happy are our customers today? What's the trend, right? That's an example of a question we're trying to answer in current value. And so then put in that light, and in light of the goals we're trying to reach, the measures then become evidence as opposed to just measurements, right? Instead of just metrics, whichever term we want to use here in this moment, but they become evidence. So they help us to see whether or not we're heading toward our goal. Are we making progress? Is this goal still valid? And are we maintaining that production and production capability on the top half and bottom half of the KVA? So that, to me, is the biggest context. And if you look back at that appendix again, you'll notice that it's titled Example Key Value Measures, KVMs, because they are meant to feed our thinking and our thought process so that we go, oh, I see, I get it. And then you can come up with your own that are most valuable in your specific circumstance. Something else I'm going to say is you can it's a lot easier to look at the bottom half there. The time to market and the ability to innovate tends to be easier to find existing measures, especially when I'm talking to our technical folks in software development. We got those typically in spades. The top half is more context specific, and you'll notice that the number of examples in the guide of the KVMs gets less on the top half, and in fact, in the upper left, so to speak, in the unrealized value, there's only 3 examples because it is very context specific. So this is my first talk off to it anyway, to get closer there. I know, Chris, you've got a way of describing the top and bottom half while I'm pulling up the diagram here with those main questions. I can share that on the screen here.
If you look at the chart that's out there for the key value areas, it differentiates between market value and organizational capability. This makes me think of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. When looking at this, he talks about the goose that laid the golden egg. If any of you are familiar with that story, I'll spare telling the whole story. But basically, the golden eggs are the value that we're getting now. And the goose, or the capability, is how are we doing at being able to enable value in the future? And so looking at both of those and balancing those, it allows us to ask deeper questions beyond the 4 questions that you see here and get to those in a way that enables evidence for us. And I can't believe that I'm talking about a goose and a golden egg on a webinar. Let me just point that out.
Here's a good question, actually, and this might move a little bit further away from the golden egg and goose story, but Chris, I'm sure you're going to be able to weave this in. For those who are thinking about, it's kind of strange, right? We go evidence, and in the guide, and we go, what are you measuring? And then I'm not actually that interested in what you're measuring by the problem, what you're trying to learn from that, right? So we're kind of being a little bit, we're very principle based in the guide. But what would you suggest for people who are saying, you know what, I am in an agile transformation, and I want to know what measures could I use to help me understand an organization's ability to change, to respond to change. What should I be looking at to see that they're becoming more agile? If we're saying that what organizations want with agility, and the reasons that they're scaling agility and agile is because they want to be able to be more responsive. Should they be looking at certain metrics, certain measurements in the KVAs that will inform them? And I'll see what you guys say, and then I'll chime in.
She's got the right answer. She's testing us. No,
I'm the worst. This is why this is why nobody lets me into a classroom.
I think I can't go without saying it. Agile is never the goal. It's agile in pursuit of value. So agile is that bottom half. If you were to ask my opinion of it, agile is the bottom half, is how are we doing at being able to respond to customer needs? But you can have organizations that are really, really responsive and they keep delivering garbage. So we need to balance that with what is it that our customers are actually using? What is it they actually find value in? One of the things I talk about in our product owner class is balancing a couple of ones that are really prevalent to me as product owner. So we talk about things like innovation rate. How much time are you spending on new stuff versus fixing and dealing with defects and maintenance and support? because that's how you want to free up your time to be able to work on new stuff that's potentially valuable for customers. How often are customers using what you put out there? How often are they actually upgrading if you're going through an upgrade cycle? Things like that are the ones that stick out to me as really relevant for initial measures.
I really like the time to learn measure. If I was just to pick one, which is like picking your favorite child or something, I mean, it's completely unfair. And yet I think it brings a really good conversation out that if we're looking at time to learn, which is technically a time to market measure down here, right? What that requires us, or invites us, I should say, to do is to say, like, we are running an experiment. We're trying to learn something. And to Chris's point, the point of doing all this is value, right? We're trying to deliver higher value things, which is the top half. So, typically we're working at a product and we're saying we want to, meet some satisfaction gap here. We want to try and capture some of this unrealized value and move it over into current value. And the thing about this time to learn down here in time to market is to say, how quickly are we able to say, we think we see this up here in unrealized value that we think we can capture. So we create this hypothesis, if we do this, we think we will see this value. So we run a small experiment. How quickly can we do it? Can we actually innovate to do that? Those things join together and try and capture that value and move it over to the current value. So that's why I like time to learn, is it kind of brings the whole picture in the way I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and there's if you look in the guide, I believe we've listed the resource on time to learn, and there's blogs about that on our website. So I think the interesting thing, and you guys obviously mentioned value, and we're talking about goals and thinking about what you're trying to get. I think I've been playing with the idea: is there one measure that we would say, you know what, you need to be tracking this for your time to market and ability to innovate? And I think the thing is that when we're looking at an organization's time ability to pivot, there's a few different things. So, I would start with the notion that sometimes organizations don't know their goals. I've been guilty of this or participated in this in organizations where we go, more new stuff, more new stuff, more new stuff. And then we find our ability to innovate, we're not even looking at where we're dedicating our efforts and where we're spending money to maintain all those old versions of things, right? So even looking at that is something pretty simple to say, hey, instead of just throwing more new stuff that nobody can use or wants to use, can we look at our ability to innovate and see where we can save some money there? The other thing is that when we think about an agile transformation, or when we're trying to make that something that we're trying to pursue, use to gain value, a lot of times what an organization will just measure, and here's an example of something that's not in the guide as a KBM, how much money do we spend on agile coaches and consulting, right? So they might be tracking that, but they're tracking that without the understanding of what internal change has been happening. So those are things that we would want to baseline, and we'd have to say, okay, you know what, let's look at how do we measure what waste we have. So let's just see if we're bringing that in, and if we're getting better about technical debt and all those different things. We might want to approach it that way and say, you know what, we are getting better, but you have to be with an organization or with teams that are ready to say, let's take a good look in the mirror and see where we are right now. And if we're going to try to get better so that we can pursue more value, is that really happening? Are they actually, embracing the values? Are they using Scrum? Are they using empiricism? Are they using EBM? But to what Mark and Chris were touching upon before is, if you're just going to try to get really, really fast with the bottom two key value areas, hopefully you're able to use that to pursue some value, because otherwise, Kurt Bittner always talks about it. It's like you're going to be able to run, but you're going to be able to go, 100 miles in the wrong way. It makes me think about, I used to live in Paris. I was in a Lotus sports car, and it's the stupidest place to be in a race car in the city of Paris, because you can't get anywhere. I'm getting from point A to point, somebody was trying to impress me. Getting from point A to point B, I would get there faster walking or taking the metro. And that's kind of how I think about it. All right. So here's some other questions that are coming up. This is going quite fast. How is actually, before we get into that one, someone says EBM seems to be put even more at the center of everything, from a user loop feedback to measure current value and unrealized value. Should this be coming from the Scrum teams that are focused on the organization's products?
Chris is rubbing his hands together. Let me give a quick preamble, because I know Chris has a lot of good here. When I talk about this, I typically start by asking the question in like a workshop format: what measures are you using today? And people just put out all their measures, on sticky notes or whatever, in Mural or whatnot. And then I introduce the key value areas, and I'm like, okay, drag them over onto the KVA map we're just looking at a minute ago, and you'll see where they're populated. And time again, the bottom half is well populated, and the top half is not. And if there are things in the top half, they're typically over in current value. Now, to be fair, I haven't run a class with a bunch of user experience experts, because I have a feeling that would be a different result. But I'm just going to say, in general, the focus on the value part that you're asking about here is, in my experience, is simply not as emphasized. And so I do think there's an invitation here, a nudging, if I can put it in the softest way, to look at those top half things. So I'll pass it over to Chris, who loves product and value.
Yeah, I think the question is, if I was to read the heart of the question, it's who's doing the inspection, who's looking at the metrics. I would say, what better than the Scrum team? I get this question a lot of, should Scrum teams handle their own support calls? And I think it helps. My default is almost always going to be yes, because it helps them see the value of their product. I also think that spending time reflecting, that's what your sprint review is there for, is saying, how are our users using our product? We talk about stakeholders attending sprint reviews. Stakeholders doesn't just mean people inside your company. It also means your users, buyers, anybody that holds a stake in your product. So yes, I think Scrum teams are really, really well suited to look at that. And a product owner needs that feedback. They need that information, because they're the value maximizer. In order to effectively do their job, they need to know how people are actually using the product. And that's where the next investment goes into. And they run experiments, and then they validate that and continue to invest in that. Okay,
Mr. Conlin. Well, then here's a couple follow-up questions for you. So to get evidence back to the team, the caveat here says it's an agile team. And to reiterate their product work effectively, what's a good frequency? And what is that frequency after a feature launch? So let's say, how often should we be looking at the measurements, and how long would you suggest this after closing an epic? So now we're getting really into product specific stuff. And this person's worried that they're not getting, or they're getting enough data to analyze back to the team. It's taking too long. And especially when you're looking at the broader business metrics. So this is probably an interesting thing about frequency, looking, probably alignment, and I really hate that I'm going to do this to you, but you're welcome, leading and lagging metrics.
I figured that one was coming, so it's fine. Exactly 3.7 days is how frequently.
Oh, minus 4.1. Okay.
I think it depends on a lot of factors again. I think it depends on your organization's risk appetite. People ask me all the time, what's a good sprint length? And the way that I like to phrase it is, it's the maximum amount you're willing to invest before you find out you're wrong. Because at least every month or less, depending on how frequent or how long your sprint length is, this is when we're stopping and have the safety net of inspecting and reviewing what it is that we actually put in the hands of our customers. leading and lagging does fit in there. And like to talk about product ownership being both art and science. And this is a little bit of the art piece of it, is you're never going to have enough information to be 100% confident in a decision. One of the things Jeff Bezos at Amazon talks about all the time was his 60% decision. We have 60% of the information we need to feel confident enough. And I think that's going to play in as we make decisions about how do we continue to invest in our products. It's how do we know that we have enough to continue to fund the next thing. I've worked with organizations that spent millions of dollars on features that were really successful for some of their competitors, but when they applied it to their context, they were 100% sure that it was going to work for them. And they spent $7.5 million, an example I can think of, and they only got $75,000 in revenue out of that. And it goes back to the curiosity that Mark talked about earlier. How do we invest that and continue to be curious around what it is that we're delivering?
I'm gonna ask you to all watch this beautiful segue I'm gonna make. So I was talking to somebody who was a product owner, and they implemented feature A, implemented feature B. Nobody's using the features. They're trying to say, why isn't they're just looking and doing all this research, and then they put in feature C, and then all of a sudden A and B are getting used. So it's this interesting thing around predictability, and if we just speed up our ability to try to work on different outcomes, maybe we'll learn more that way rather than just trying to predict everything. So Mark Wavle, for an organization that's focusing on predictability, deadlines, and dates as, that triangle, let's just improve on this. How would you talk to them maybe to leadership? How would you talk to them to think about value? What is that? Maybe you want to throw in the golden goose story here, you can, but I think you have some great thoughts about this.
Yeah, this is the empirical sales pitch, if I can put it that way, right? If we know for sure the factors, what it is that's valuable to our users, and we know for sure how we're going to get there, and those things are stable and not changing, there's no ambiguity, there's agreement, then that's an appropriate approach. Go for it. As I like to say sometimes, when you walk into McDonald's and order a cheeseburger, you want them to just go make the freaking cheeseburger in the back, right? They know what value is. It's a hot, fresh cheeseburger, melty cheese wrapped in the yellow paper, delivered quickly to you. And so they're not in the back going like, hey, team, how do we want to make the cheeseburger today, right? That's not the question. And so that's the type of problem that's appropriate for. Now, the thing that you want to think about there is they're trying to manage the risk that we're being inefficient in doing that it costs too much, that it's too slow, that kind of stuff. That's appropriate for that kind of problem. If we're really in this area where we don't know a lot, where we're trying to learn, right? Where we say, we don't know for sure what's valuable to the user, and we're trying to learn what that is. We don't know for sure this is the best way to build it, the right timing, all that kind of stuff. We're trying to figure that out. Then that approach is one where we will get, as you said, 100 miles from here really fast, and it's not the place we need to be. And we don't know until we get there, maybe even after that. So the risk is different, and that's how I usually approach this conversation. I might not give that exact talk off to a leader like that, but the point is, what's the risk that they're taking by being so certain that this is the direction we need to go, and we just need to hit this date and this budget with this scope? Like, they're absolutely sure about that. So if we do that, we'll definitely have value for our user. And the key there is to try and find where their risk area is, and then help them manage that better. So if you can align yourself with their risk area, that, example being, hey, so what evidence do we have, or what indicators do we have that this is what the customers need, the thing that we're investing in. So if you can essentially help arouse their curiosity about that, or recognize some of the risk in it and find a better risk management approach, which is empiricism, then that usually goes a long way to them being open to this type of conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's really my hope, at least, that as we start to think about EBM more, organizations use EBM more, it's helping them change the conversation, and we see the conversations change and the culture change, that we can start talking about how do we think about risk, and how do we now think about investment differently. And so we probably don't have enough time to dive into that, but that starts getting into that portfolio conversation. And there are questions here around, probably what about all the product management measurements and data that I collect? Does this fit? And for me, yes, as a product owner, kind of like Chris was saying, I want to know this information so that I can make decisions with the different information that I have. In terms of the risk, one of the things that we have inside EBM that we call out, also the Scrum Guide 2020 added this notion of product goal, but we talk about goals. And that's the goals that we have. So there's the strategic, intermediate, tactical, are thinking about goals in the notion of time. And so that is also, there's a risk there component. And it doesn't say, hey, we're trying to do this thing, and that's the thing that we have to hit, and it must be right because 10 years ago we decided it was. And we can get a little bit into the difference between OKRs, or how you can make OKRs and better with EBM thinking. But there's a good question here that's very simple. Is just, what examples have you guys seen as strategic goals as consultants? And I can tell everyone, the strategic goal, for instance, that I have for enterprise agility at Scrum.org is I'm trying to move organizations away from zombie transformations and zombie Scrum. Not easy. And EBM is one thing that I'm trying to do to have that conversation and move people away from that agile theater. What examples do you guys have of strategic goals that you've seen? It can be good or bad. They're not always.
There's a bank I was working with that I think had a really, really good strategic goal. I'm going to change the wording a little bit to protect the innocent. But everyone in the organization knew what the goal was, and it was around customer focus and trust. So everything that they did, every product that they invested in was able to tie back to that organizational goal and say, this is how we're contributing to this. When they came to investment decisions, they were able to tie things back for the healthy parts of that organization. They were able to tie that back to, this is how we're contributing overall to the strategic goal.
For that software vendor that I was talking about, the package software vendor, the way that, they had tons of that data. They had a lot of, analysis and so on. I love the way that they just worded it as a strategic goal. It's so simple and it was memorable and everybody knew it. They said, we want our customers to say, I love and trust this product, which was their way of saying, our customer satisfaction with our product is higher, right? All those things I talked about a minute ago. And I trust this product because they wanted to increase the quality of it. So I love and trust this product kind of encapsulated that. They wanted their employees to say, I love working here. Mm-hmm. And that pulled in all four. It was very simple, but it really provided them with that focal direction, I guess I'd say, at that very high level.
And that's something that can be inspirational and motivating, and not just an output of, improve revenue by 77%.
Oh, you didn't go there.
by 2023. And so that can kind of dive into the OKR conversation. But Chris, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's a fun example because it's been in the news a whole lot lately. And Patricia, you knew I could not bring this example up. There's an airline that is attempting to allow anybody to travel anywhere in the world in under 4 hours for under $100. It's a company called Boom Supersonic, trying to, I don't know if anybody remembers the Concorde jets from back in the day, but they're trying to create supersonic flight in a cheap and iterative way. And they had a really good article in CNN that helped illustrate all of the things we're talking about empiricism, because they broke down their goals into manageable chunks where they were able to test and prove or disprove whether their ultimate strategic goal was something that could be accomplished or not. And I just love the empiricism that they bake into it and talking about how to break goals down. I thought it was a good example. So Boom Supersonic, feel free to check it out. If anybody from Boom Supersonic is watching, I'll take royalties for future of your company.
We reference you all the time. And if you go out to their website and go into the media section and read, you'll find plenty of articles that have what Chris just said. It's like the headline. Go read one of those. It's like, you'll go, oh, there's a strategic goal. It'll like hit you on the head. Oh my gosh, that's an intermediate goal. Like you can find all that right in the article.
Other companies that have awesome goals that might be, people think, is that a vision or is that a goal? It's another conversation. But like Patagonia, people talk about those kind of mission-based goals. One thing for, I think, people listening is to think about unrealized value. If we're looking at that satisfaction gaps, people want something. People want to fly places cheap. Some people. Should we close that gap? Is that the opportunity? I've mentioned OKRs enough times where we need to answer the question, how different, the question specifically is how different is OKR from EBM?
Very.
Next question. No, I'm just kidding.
I think OKRs are one way, and they've been around, they're coming back. OKRs, they've been abandoned by some organizations, they come back. They are a way that used appropriately are great goal setting techniques. I think for EBM, and you can use them in conjunction, is to say, is that outcome based? Are we thinking about the value from it? And are we using empiricism rather than using a checklist to go check, 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 check? And there's just bad form of how people interpret OKRs right now. What we do in EBM is we say, okay, now we're doing that. What is the capability and how is this actually helping the organization progress? Think about the KBAs now. We have maybe this OKR. Could we look at the KR in the different KBAs? And that might be one way that they can be, they can be married together. The thing that I have seen is when organizations have teams that say, oh, Patricia, we're using OKRs and there's no empiricism. It's just OKR. And what if that O is wrong? How do we know?
Yeah. So OKRs, objectives and key results. I see that used, I've seen it used very poorly in organizations. I've also seen it used really well. You talked about the good side, Patricia. The bad side that I see for organizations is when it's set top down, no involvement, no collaboration. It's very much focused specifically only on numbers without necessarily context for why that is actually a goal. And folks interpret the meaning for that, and they may not actually understand what the real goal is or what the real intent is. And they're spending a lot of money, spending a lot of time, spending a lot of energy investing towards something. And they're bringing in these key results, or they're trying to pad it in a way that shows that we are meeting this and looking at it from a position of certainty and not a position of curiosity or humility. And so a lot of money can get invested in something that is maybe not what it was intended to be.
Yeah, I love how we tied together almost everything we talked about in the answer to that question, because right, ideally the objectives and key results objective is your goal, and you have a good outcome oriented goal, not an output or activity based goal. And your key results are evidence, right? You could kind of connect those things into EBM. You don't have to do OKRs to do EBM. You don't have to do EBM to do OKRs, but to work in a complex environment, you're going to need empiricism in there, and that's really the key. That if we hold OKRs in a predictable, certain way, that's where it gets cascaded down. That's where we're only asking the question, how are we doing at progress on our plan, and not asking, is this objective still the most valuable one? What did we learn by doing this? So I think I was doing a webinar yesterday about EBM. Somebody brought, and they were thinking very deeply. I was watching their face while I was doing the webinar. Finally, at the end, he says, I know a lot about OKRs. We use them here at this company. And I'm thinking now that OKRs and evidence-based management can fit really well together, right? That they can mesh really well together, and EBM can help us hold OKRs appropriately and use them really effectively. And I was like, couldn't have said it better. That's a really good way to look at it.
Well done, Mark. Let me ask you this then, as your, maybe we'll probably have time for 2 more questions. Who does the evidence-based management framework support? Would you say it's product owners, management, the team, the Scrum masters? How do you, thank you. How do you think of that if someone were to say who should be doing this, and who does it actually support? Who cares? Is this just management porn?
I think,
I think,
oh, you go for it, Mark.
I mean, the answer is yes, very simply. But to dive into that a little more deeply, I mean, as a product owner, I think Chris has made an excellent case for how it enables product owners to think empirically at a larger scale than just their product backlog, or even to look at the items in their product backlog and their product goal in a more empirical way. But also then looking at a higher level, right? You're looking across maybe a product line, or you're looking across a department or a whole organization. And this is where you start to get into the management or the upper leadership of the organization who's not on a Scrum team. I haven't met a senior vice president on a Scrum team yet. I'm sure it happens somewhere. But that level there, how do they do empiricism? How can they get involved in that when they're not in a sprint cycle? And this is helping them shift into that mindset and giving them some of those tools and principles to operate in that way. So I would say that I'm going to say the team themselves, if they're doing Scrum really well, is actually in this already, right? If they're doing professional grade Scrum, that this is how it looks. And for the Scrum Master, this, as the person who is ideally coaching, being the change agent of all the people I just mentioned, giving them the tools to be able to have those conversations, to enable that, to model that, and to mentor and teach others to do that.
I have seen this where it just changes the dynamic, right? So like I've seen it where executive management, when they were looking, they were saying, wow, for the first time, I'm just not looking at lines and dots. I'm seeing the progress of our product and business. For middle management, it's I'm no longer being managed or managing on outputs. I understand that we're trying to work towards something. What does that look like? And for the teams, it says that goal that's so far away, it's kind of fluffy, but I can start to see the progress that we're making toward that in terms of that outcome. Chris, one last question for you, actually. Somebody was saying that for them, they feel that EBM brings the ability of road mapping. Instead of writing a roadmap as rigid documentation to just refer back to over time, how we're doing on the roadmap. What are your thoughts on that?
Whoever wrote that, hit me up on LinkedIn. That is an awesome question, but I'll address it here. I want to talk to you more because that's a great interpretation of this. Too often I see roadmaps as a rigid plan of saying, here's what we're going to do this quarter, here's what we're going to do this quarter, here's what we're going to do this quarter. There was a great VP of product I worked with. Her name was Jenny. And she really helped our organization shift from outputs and feature delivery to what's the customer outcome that we're trying to get to. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with these different types of goals, is look and forecast, where is it we're trying to go? What's the intended direction? We may not know we're going to end up at this exact coordinates, this latitude and longitude, but this is the direction we're going, northeast, and trying to figure out how we get there and whether that's still relevant along the way, which is what I see really good roadmaps do, is they say, here's what we believe now, and it starts to get fuzzier the further out we go. So yes, short answer, yeah, I think that's a great interpretation of it.
I love that. I want to hear more about how that goes. So I'm going to just quickly reference this in terms of, when you think about EBM and how to get started and what can you use. And Ken Schwaber has always said to me, Trish, don't continue polishing your sneakers. Like, don't spend all that time just polishing a sneaker. And I want people to think about, Scrum that way, Nexus that way, EBM that way. And I come from a startup background, and I understand. So when we think about, okay, there's a lot of information that we can get when we're in an organization, and we might have the ability to do that. But when you're in a startup, you're trying to hustle. And one of the things that happens is, I think if I were thinking about EBM, and this is actually how I came to Agile, if I was thinking about EBM in those times, and it's exactly what I do now, and it doesn't take me that long to say, what are the goals that we're trying to hit, and go beyond the goal is to like get cash in the door. Think about what are the different goals, and what are the things that are, what's my time to market? Like, how long did it take me to do stuff? What's my ability to innovate? What's holding me back? And the value pieces, if you just sit down, and honestly, I've done it 10, 20, 30 minutes, getting those little pieces or at least the goals down will probably serve you in terms of using empiricism in a startup way. So we're at the end of our time box. I do want to thank everybody. We have a lot of questions that are still unanswered. I promise that we'll take a look at them and give them some thought and share them back with all y'all. Tons of places for you to interact with us more. We're all available on LinkedIn. Tell us you were talking to us today here, and get us any more questions maybe that way. There's different learning paths with a lot of information. There's great OKR blogs. Investing for Business Agility are some papers I'd recommend people read. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris and Mark. I really appreciate your time. Can't wait to do something like this again.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.